Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech, episode 69. I'm here with Charlie Araujo from Symphony. How are you today?
I am great. I am great. It's the heart of summer. It is warming up. We had, of course, the July 4th Independence Day
Hmm.
weekend here in the US, and it's an interesting thing. I mean, it was a long weekend, right? So it happened on a Friday, so it's a long weekend. And New York City is interesting. It just sort of cleared out. It was wild. It's like there was nobody around. It was sort of nice. So and then the other big exciting news, and this is not unique in New York City, or certainly not New York City, but even to this part of New York City. But where I happen to live, there's this little area where they call it Firefly Alley. There's just like
Hmm.
a huge swath of fireflies. And so my 2-year-old is just absolutely loving it. We come home at dusk and there's just fireflies everywhere. And so he's enjoying that. So that's the highlight of our summer evenings right now. How about you?
Oh, nice. Yeah, we actually, my wife and I watched the fireworks in the 4th of July, and for a change, there was no fog. So we were actually able to see the fireworks in San Francisco, then look south and see the fireworks in Oakland, and just kind of enjoy, every municipality doing their own fireworks show.
And of course, this is also sort of the traditional kickoff of the summer doldrums of tech. Tech has historically slowed down. COVID changed that a little bit, where it's not quite as dead in the summer months as it used to be. But I think we're sort of seeing that play out. We don't have a ton of news, right? Most of the spring conferences are now all over, and so we're kind of an interesting set. But not to leave us in the complete doldrums, Cloudflare introduced an interesting feature that I think I don't know if it's right. I mean, I think it's um, interesting development. We'll see how it plays out. So maybe you can cue it up. But basically, they've introduced a pay per crawl feature, which I, by the way, I completely missed this, and all my flipping reading, I did not see this one come across. And it's fascinating, right? Because the basic idea here, if I'm understanding it right, is that particularly in the world of like search, right? When you would normally make your money by having people land on your site and then being able to monetize ads or whatever, that these agents from Google's AI summaries to people like Perplexity, the different AI tools have sort of taken a lot of that traffic away. And so Cloudflare is trying to help their customers, website providers,
Hmm.
overcome some of this by effectively monetizing those crawls. I think the details are still a little bit scarce, and it's a very complex sort of process, but it's quite interesting to me. It's like I'm still processing. Like, is this going to work? Does this make sense? Is this really how we resolve this? I don't know. I mean, you added more details, and what was your take on it?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting as well. This idea that Cloudflare is looking at the world and saying AI bots are taking over everything. They are definitely pinging websites like crazy and basically sucking out all of the information, bringing it into their model, and then making it so that a lot of us are now going to ChatGPT or Anthropic Claude or Google Gemini or Grok or whatever have you, and we are all typing in our questions, getting our replies, and never going to the website where the information came from. So they are taking the obvious next step and saying, well, somebody's got to make money for the unique content that is being created. And they're saying, let's do some sort of monetization per crawl so that every time a bot tries to access your website, they have to provide some sort of payment information based on what your website asks for, or they can't hit it. And this is going to be especially important for both primary information websites that constantly update what they're doing, such as newspapers and magazines and journalistic content, as well as highly trusted content providers that are just important due to the sheer scale of what they are, such as Microsoft or SAP or Oracle, where they are providing updates and you're going to want those updates no matter who you are. So there's a lot of that's an interesting new dynamic that could potentially come into play.
It really is, and the reason I said I'm so torn on this is that on the one hand I get it. So in my other life, my wife and I had a lifestyle brand, and we were very much driven by search traffic and SEO. And we've talked in the
Mm-hmm.
past about AI changing the world of SEO and what that looks like, and increasingly building websites that are optimized for AI agents or AI tools to go in and scrape that site and look at it. And so I get it on one hand. On the other hand, there's this line from, I think it was the very first Jurassic Park movie. Jeff Goldblum's character, at the end of it all, they're saying, like, I think we've got this under control. And his statement was, nature always finds a way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in this context, the nature of the internet is that information wants to be free. I mean, we see all these sort of fights over paywalls. And look, I mean, I spent a good chunk of my career as a content creator and want to get paid for generating and producing that meaningful content. But I think if I look at this, it's this very significant sort of battle going on. And it's not, when I say it's a battle, that makes it sound like it's just this war, but it's really this conflicting set of priorities that as organizations have to go through and just across this entire sort of ecosystem. And it's not clear to me how this wins, because I think if every single provider signs up for this, if every single provider says, you cannot crawl my site unless you pay me, then sure, this probably works, right? But as long as there is somebody willing to give away that information for free for whatever reason,
Mm-hmm.
then this sort of falls apart, right? It becomes the lowest common denominator. There's another aspect of it, and maybe I'm an anomaly here, but I rarely, I mean, if I'm asking a super simple question, right? What is so-and-so's birthday, or who's the cast in this movie?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I get that. I'm probably going to take what the AI provides and be done with it. But like right now, in preparation for this podcast, I have all the windows up of all the articles we're going to be talking about. I have an AI summary alongside every one of them, right? I have, when I'm going through and doing research and I'm asking Perplexity, I use, I think I mentioned I use Raycast, and I have these tools, and provides me links. I go and click every single one of those links if I'm going to rely on that data. So for me, they're absolutely still getting my referral traffic. It is not like I'm just taking it at face value 90% of the time. But maybe I'm the anomaly there because I know enough of it to know not to trust it entirely. But I also think it's a question of, well, this is going to continue to evolve, the technology, and therefore the quality of it, and our trust level will increase. Will that change? I don't know. I think so. Like I said, this is where I found this very interesting, mostly because it's a solution to the problem. I'm not sure if it's the right solution. I'm not sure if it's the end solution, but it certainly points to the fact that we've got a challenge that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, I think there's just gonna keep going in a couple of different directions. That if you have, on the one hand, if you have specific differentiated content that is truly unique and or branded in a way that it's important, or you're Kim Kardashian and whatever your brand, you have that brand name, then you're going to be able to continue charging, and you might charge extravagant amounts. But there will always be parties that are incentivized to gain influence, who are going to give away their version of the information for free. And those are probably the versions that are going to be most prevalent in the AI models going forward. They will update their data frequently. They will at least have the patina of being understandable and relevant and reliable. And they may not be the traditional media players or experts that we are used to seeing. We're going to find some new way to game the system, as we always have.
I also think this points to another interesting development that we're going to see more and more of. If you remember, I think on the show, I couldn't tell you. I'll make Lynn's job difficult to try to go find this one to reference. But we had a video that we shared where it was these two AI chatbots talking to one another, right? One, I think, for a hotel, and right. And this idea of this sort of machine-to-machine interaction, I think we're going to see more of that, right? Because that's really what this is. This is about tuning a website, a piece of technology, for another piece of technology, in this case, an AI bot or agent that is looking at it. And the next article that we're going to talk about is basically another version of the same thing. So there was I'm not sure what this was, some kind of a conference, and there was a roundtable. And so there were representatives from Atlassian, Intuit, and AWS all talking about how they're approaching agents, and specifically, or AI agents, and specifically with respect to APIs. Mm-hmm. So, APIs, of course, are designed for human developers to have a structured mechanism to interact with another system, to connect two systems together. And what is interesting is that this whole panel was talking about how the evolution of APIs is one in which they may shift into the consumer of that API not being a human, but in fact an AI agent who is reading the API spec and developing a connection to it. Now, right now, that's actually very, very difficult to do, which I found sort of interesting. We're talking about this the way they're talking about in this article, because we really aren't there for the most part, which is part of why like things like MCP are becoming so popular, because it's sort of the API for agents. But nevertheless, it points to this idea where the increasing evolution of technology is that there's this component that you have to be designing for the consumption by AI technologies to be that primary consumer. And so I don't know, what was your take? I mean, I felt I took this with a pretty big bite of skepticism, but I mean, what was your take on this particular their take on this?
Yeah, I find the agentic discussion to be very challenging right now, partially because the definitions are all over the place. Everybody and their grandmother has their definition of what an agent is in the tech world. Literally every software provider is saying they're providing agents. And when I think of agents, I go back to kind of how I feel like big tech is describing agents right now. Either agents are initiating work in some way, they're facilitating some sort of interaction, they're solving some sort of problem, or they're doing the soup to nuts complete task, going through multiple steps and figuring out stuff along the way. And that fourth version, that last version is kind of where everybody thinks agents are, but frankly, most agents are not. Those smarter agents that can actually figure out what's going on and try to figure out how to manipulate APIs and get work done at the end of the day is, I think, where everybody assumes agentic AI is already. And I think that's an interesting place to someday get to. I think that in reality, although some agents can access APIs also aren't always obvious enough for agents to be able to read very easily. And so I do think there's this room for something that is more either natural language based or some sort of intermediate bot language like that Jabber or Jibber Jabber, or whatever it was called that you're talking about. There's definitely room for bots to be able to share language between each other more quickly and in a more machine friendly manner too.
Well, I mean, very specific to this particular point, I'm actually very skeptical on the ability for us to adapt APIs for truly autonomous agent usage, mostly because the spec was built off this idea that the actual API instructions were in a separate space, right? It was in a document. These are not an API is not self-documenting. And I think in order for an API to truly be consumable by an agent, it has to be self-documenting. It has to start with a definition of itself that says, this is how to use me, so the agent can process that. Right now, the agent, the only way you can make it do is the agent would have to know how to go search for the API documentation, hope it finds it, rationalize that it's the right one. I mean, it's almost insanity, which is why something like MCP, it's really what MCP is doing, is it's publicizing, hey, this is how you connect to me, this is how you interact with me, and therefore it's a spec for the agent to work. So I'm kind of skeptical on that, but I do think you are pointing out the challenge we have. We have the longstanding challenge with the sort of definitional problem of what is an agent, what does it mean, and does it even matter if we're calling it, right? At the end of the day, the question is, are you solving a problem, and if so, how are you doing that? But I think we've got this massive hype problem, and actually, I'll let you cue this up because you found these. But you in your studies, you found two of them. They're like this. Oh my gosh, super deep reading. But in a nutshell, they both basically say the same thing, which is, hey, this technology is not really everything that the hype is leading you to believe, at least not today, particularly when it comes to these complex enterprise-focused challenges that we're talking about here. So why don't you cue these up, because they're very similar actually, and we can just chat about what it really means.
Yeah, one interesting study I found was done by Carnegie Mellon recently. They have this kind of faux structure called the agent company, which they use to figure out the performance of agents in conducting business tasks. So they put a lot of work into figuring out what are business tasks, and then being able to look at how each type of agent how agents will go through those tasks, and then they can plug in all the models that come in and say which models are better at getting actual business tasks done and from beginning to end. And they're finding that at best, right now, models are getting about 30% of work done when we're talking about setting up some basic manual business tasks and then turning them into and trying to make the model do it. And 30% is the absolute best. This is what Gemini 2.5 Pro is doing, which is a pretty top of the line modern model. As we go down to, say, GPT 4.0, which is also considered a highly functioning LLM, the success rate gets down below 10%. So the models out of the box are still having a lot of problems getting complex work done or work that requires some sort of actual human judgment done, which makes a lot of sense, frankly, because we know that these models are good at finding individual relationships and doing fuzzy math, but not so great at doing hard-coded structural and mathematic tasks without some additional help or augmentation.
So I appreciated we had another study last week, I think we talked about, that pointed the same thing out, that when in fact it was the Salesforce study,
right?
That talked about the fact that we are now still struggle with these sort of enterprise use cases. So part of me says, duh, like we understand this. The frustration I have with this particular study, though, is that it's taking, and I know that in part this is OpenAI and Anthropic and Google it's their own fault, because they're trying to put this out there like these generic models and generic agents can somehow solve these very specific problems. Mm-hmm. And there's really, in my mind, maybe we'll get there and we'll talk about superintelligence later, but we're nowhere near that point right now, right? So this sort of isn't a fair use case, because they're not using models or structures that are fine-tuned, and that's a specific term, are tailored.
Right.
Are tailored to enterprise use cases where we actually have a structure to execute on this. So on the one hand, I completely agree that anyone who comes in and thinks that we can magically transform and AI is going to solve all your problems and do all this work for you, or believe the hype that we talked about last week of 50, 70, 80% of your jobs are going away because it's all going to be done by AI. It's all complete hogwash right now. Right?
Yes.
even in the best scenario. But at the same time, this idea that I can take a generic technology and apply it to every problem, particularly very complex enterprise type use cases, is flawed at its core, because we obviously have to structure and tune. And if I actually find it very useful to think about AI in terms of a human, and a human that I would hire a job, right? I can't just take a really smart person and stick them into any job, no matter how smart they are. Right. There is a degree of domain expertise, of understanding the fundamentals of how that a business or the sector operates, understanding the terminology, all of this sort of stuff. And so when we talk about crafting an environment for a specific technology or for a specific vertical or a sector or whatever, that's what's happening. And these studies are looking at this sort of really broad-based approach, and then somehow going, oh, it doesn't work for these use cases. Like, yeah, okay. So, that's, I think, the grain of salt. But the big takeaway, as well as the other study, which I think is actually much more fun to talk about, it just is a reminder that there's so much, we have so far to go with all of this technology still.
Yes. And just a note here that you should trust me and Charlie when we say you can take a smart person, can't just put them into any job, because we've both had a lot of jobs over the years. It's funny, as I've been interviewing for jobs, one of my lines is actually, I've had your job before, so I understand what it's about. I'm not saying I can do it as well as you, but I have had your job over sometime in the past 30 years. So
yeah, and there's a lot of value in that. And we're going to talk, like I said, we'll talk more about this idea of superintelligence, right? I think people can learn things, and AI is masterful at learning things to a degree. Yes. But there are severe limits. And let's talk about this other study, because this other study, I think, is actually much more important. And you go ahead, say, because I can never say any quote.
Yes. So there's this other study done by MIT and Harvard that looked at LLMs, large language models, and how they solve problems. And they brought up this interesting term called Potemkin understanding, based on Potemkin villages, the fake Soviet villages that got built to show how rich and powerful they were. But basically the understanding the idea that these models can tell you exactly how to do a job correctly, and they will convincingly say that they're going to do all the right things to get a job done. They know how to describe what they're doing, but when it comes to actually doing it, they fall short often because they don't know which particular steps they need to do to get to the end point, or they don't know which system to get to. Something breaks between here and there, much like any good consultant. And I say that having been a consultant for many years.
I think it speaks to the challenge, and again, using a human corollary for this, right? We all know the people who, they read the article, they have a basic, they've scanned something, and so they can pare it back, they can regurgitate the concepts or the words, right? But when you start probing them at all, you quickly understand they don't truly understand what's going on, and that's really the state of AI. And this, by the way, isn't a slam. Like, what my big takeaway on this study, and I think I'm glad that it was done, because I guess there are people out there that need to understand this. But the essence of this technology, and I keep hinting to the story we're going to talk about superintelligence in a second, but the essence of this technology is that it has no actual intelligence, right? It is just really good at understanding the next word. And I am personally amazed at how it's able to connect the dots, but let's not forget, all it's doing is pattern recognition. It is assembling these patterns and being able to, based on this massive knowledge base that we've given it, to figure out what sort of comes next, right? And it's amazing. It's truly amazing. But it doesn't mean it understands a dang thing, right? At all. Right. And so that's what the study really showed, is that it is this sort of fake understanding, and which is why we need to take it with a huge grain of salt. Now, that said, that's not a slam, right? Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to use, for the most of us anyway, we're trying to use AI to solve is for automation use cases that we've been trying to solve for a long time. And those automation use cases do not require this deep intrinsic understanding of how markets work or whatever, right? We need to be able to execute a process A to Z, and when we hit little snags along the way, be able to adapt to them. That's what AI can be exceptionally good at, because we can give it all the parameters, we can give it all this understanding and let it sort of figure that out. And so it's not a slam, but this idea, and it points to sort of the challenge, this idea that somehow this is a magic thing, or that it truly understands this stuff, is a complete fallacy, and that we have to get our expectations right.
Yes, one of my favorite uses for AI right now is if I have a use case or a challenge where there's 100 different parameters, I don't know how to weight that correctly. It's too fuzzy, and any attempt I make to weight all those 100 parameters is honestly probably going to be kind of weird. So I can throw all that into AI and ask, what is the typical result that happens when all of these things are taken into account? And it will at least tell me, here's the average of what happens based on what has been documented throughout human history and fed through a model. And that's a helpful starting point, because it at least gives me a benchmark idea of what to expect. And then I can tweak based on my own human judgment and where I think things might have been under or overweighted. But I don't have to make 100 decisions. I can make 5 or 10 better decisions.
Yeah. No, it's absolutely amazing. Like I said, I think it has such tremendous power and potential. But what these studies sort of speak to is how challenged so many people are in truly understanding exactly what they are and exactly what their uses are. And the one, we probably could have saved this one to the last, but it is a fun one. Along these same lines, you pulled out this LinkedIn article about this gentleman, and this one I had read, about how he basically used these AI models to try to play an Atari chess game from, what was it? I don't know if it said, but like 10 years ago or something?
Well, the Atari 2600 is the first video game console I ever had when I was
so
5.
Older than that.
So it's a 40-plus-year-old. It came around before the first Nintendo. So no matter how old you are, that's old. That's 40-plus years old. And they put up the mighty Atari 2600 against this engineer, Robert Caruso, put up the Atari 2600 against both ChatGPT and Copilot. And even before doing what I love about this is that before starting the game, Robert asked these models, are you able to play chess? And ChatGPT and Copilot both confidently said, yes, I know how to play chess. I'm going to be working 10 to 15 moves ahead. Although if I'm talking working against a single player, maybe more than like 2 or 3 moves ahead, but I'm going to play basically at the level of what I'm given, and then I will confidently beat the person on the other side. So Robert takes those instructions, it puts prompts saying we are playing chess, and then puts it against the Atari 2600 from 1981 or whatever. And the Atari 2600 beat both ChatGPT and Copilot, Microsoft Copilot. So at the end of the day, these models, you cannot fully trust them to do dynamic,
you can't trust them at all.
without
it goes
tweaking. Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were talking about, right? At the end of the day, this was not an AI model built to play chess. And now there clearly are AI models optimized to win at chess, and they will beat the pants off of any, Atari 2600 and any human
they
out
will
there,
beat
right?
Magnus Carlsen and every other grandmaster on the planet. Sure.
Exactly.
But...
so it is not that the AI in general isn't capable of doing this, but this general purpose tool and what this also speaks to, that bravado, that confidence, just tells you how much of that is in our human nature, because it's picking that up from models where people are writing versions of this where it's like, I can handle that. Of course I can.
Yeah, and ChatGPT has thousands of examples of people using that braggadocio and bravado and just saying, I know exactly how to be the best chess player ever. That's been written all sorts of times, all over the place.
So my big takeaway from all of this is a reminder of exactly how nascent this technology is, and that you have to be able to rationalize the use case of the problem you're trying to solve and make sure you're using the right tool for the problem. And there is no one size fits all, right? You have to be figuring those pieces out, which is what makes this next article that we've alluded to here a few times so fascinating to me, because the latest buzzword, the latest hype, is that, we're already past all this agentic AI. We're not even going to talk about artificial general intelligence anymore, which was supposedly the big thing, AGI, where AI is as smart as a human. But we're going to go past that. We're going to talk about superintelligence. And I think our violator in chief on this one is Mark Zuckerberg of Meta, who is on an absolute spending spree, clearly indicating or acknowledging, I guess, vis-a-vis these actions, that Llama has not lived up, and he doesn't feel like that they are doing what they need to do from an AI perspective. So he's been on this complete hiring binge of poaching some of the best AI minds in the business, which sort of begs a ancillary question, is like, can you buy your way into this market? But I think it's interesting because it's ushered in this sort of new arms race of this rush to superintelligence. And I, for one, think it's just complete hogwash for all the reasons we just talked about, that we are not even yet at a point where AI has any true understanding, where we haven't even cracked that code. That the entire concept of reasoning, as that first study or the second one we talked about pointed out is somewhat suspect. And to me, I don't even believe we're anywhere near AGI, let alone quote unquote superintelligence. So I find this fascinating, and honestly, I don't really even understand it. I don't really understand, and he's not alone, by the way. I mean, Altman's talking about this. There's a bunch of folks talking about this rush to superintelligence. So either they know stuff that we don't about what's really going on in their labs, and it's all mind blowing, or I don't know. I mean, what was your take on this whole rise of superintelligence? Because it's really just the last couple of weeks that this has started hitting the mainstream.
Yeah, I find both the superintelligence and AGI, artificial general intelligence discussions to be super strange, quite frankly, because I feel like when we're testing AI models and to figure out how smart they are, we test them in a kind of a structure that is very much like taking an advanced placement or international baccalaureate test, something you might take in high school, and it shows your capability to pass, say, an introductory college class in a particular topic. But if you've ever done graduate work at any level, you know that graduate research is about doing sustained research for a matter of months, sometimes years, to look for novel and interesting new trends. When we give out Nobel Prizes, we don't give it to somebody who did the best on a test. Seriously, we do it to someone who does 5, 10, 15 years of research in a very specific topic, and came out with one new novel capability that ends up changing the world. That's what we give Nobel Prizes to, and that's what we consider to be intelligence at a world-class level. It's not usually about doing one particular task at one particular time. It's always about doing something that fundamentally changes the way we see the world. And whether that's Michael Jordan in basketball, or creating CRISPR for DNA, or looking at quantum mechanics and quantum world in physics, those are the type, figuring out that stuff at a new and novel way. That's what we consider genius. And I've seen zero evidence that AI models are able to do that kind of novel, game-changing thinking. Although they scale a bunch of what we know like really well.
I think they're amazing tools to help humans do that. And there are a handful of examples of AI identifying novel things, but almost exclusively those are simply because they were able to identify patterns that humans were, it was maybe too complex for human to find, at least in the normal course of action. And so, I think
I've got Einstein right here. It's like we don't have an AI who is actually Einstein, even though Salesforce tried to convince us of that for a while.
That's the beauty of marketing. So I do find this whole thing really fascinating, and like I said, I don't know if this is just about the stock market and about investors and about trying to get past it. But what I don't fully understand is there's still so much ground to cover, and I think probably more than anything. And again, maybe they're doing something that we're not aware of. But the thing that I struggle with is that what is becoming increasingly clear to me is that the LLM approach to driving this, I think it's going to hit a wall. I actually am not convinced that this is the technology approach that actually is going to get us to AGI, let alone super intelligence, whatever that means. And so I think, to me, the big rush would be on what is that new approach, that new novel way of addressing this. And maybe it's an extension of LLMs, but as these other studies have just pointed out, the risk is that they are sort of they just kind of pull us back to average, right? They're not about this novel creation, and they're not even, because of that lack of deep understanding, they're really not even capable today of executing tasks that your average high schooler can do, or these sort of complex processes that I could give somebody, right? I mean, and so I think those are the challenges that we still have in front of us around it. And so it's this really interesting space that we're in, where it's like, on the one hand, we're having these conversations about how we can't do basic execution. I had a buddy of mine say that he's talking to a bunch of professors and saying all this, basically we're still years away from agentic AI being real, which I don't believe that's truly true. But it speaks to the fact that there's that reality, and then we have this sort of talk, and it just, kind of crazy.
No, I think agentic AI is close, but partially because we are going to be able to create systems that figure out very specific types of reasoning for specific tasks that we're trying to get done. But this goes way beyond what we can cover in the podcast. But when we think about our brains, our brains are basically working on a few watts of power. There are multiple specific systems that are that have been evolved over millions of years to do specific tasks extremely well, and things that go together, multiple layers of networking, like all of a lot of that is just not being covered by large language models, and they're not intended to be, because large language models build things from scratch from these 4 or 5 character tokens that we use, and then we push them through parameters, and then we get these higher level logics that are kind of like the way we think, but not actually the way we think. And I think it's important for us to just realize, hey, we're doing all this stuff that is kind of imitating what brains do, but not quite. Because for one thing, we're not building nuclear power plants to power our brains. We don't need to. Our brains are much more efficient and much more specialized in ways that we are not taking into account if we're thinking about super intelligence.
All right. Well, I guess so. If you need super intelligence, you're going to have to rely on Hyoun for now, because that's what you've got to work with. All right. So let's get a little more pragmatic. Our final 2 stories before we do our wrap up, very pragmatic, and I think they're interesting. The first one here, near and dear to your heart, and that is that this is a study. This is Flexera. Flexera did a study and found that this is actually shocking never to me, that half of organizations are reporting spending $1 million or more on their software vendor reviews. And this is just pointing to the fact that we have this growing issue. We spend all of our time and energy talking about AI and even the cloud, but really SaaS has become a huge, huge challenge here as organizations put more and more on SaaS and are trying to sort it all out. I mean, what was your takeaway on this? Again, I found this like not horribly surprising, but a little shocking in terms of the amount of spend and the amount of challenge that this represents.
Yeah, so Flexera did the study for their state of IT asset management. Their bias is obviously towards large enterprises, but at the large enterprise level, half of businesses basically have done million-dollar audits to figure out what the hell is going on with their SaaS inventory and accounts. I find that extremely believable, especially with the amount of money that is going on here, that if you're trying to manage $50 million in spending 1 million to save 5 million obviously ends up being a no-brainer at the end of the day. But because it's also distributed and there's such a massive long tail beyond the first couple hundred applications that exist within an enterprise, all this is difficult. And that long tail is probably 800, 900, 1,000 additional apps that exist. Right now, we are dealing with a lot of technical debt because everybody has been bringing in their favorite app or service or capability to do whatever they want. There's a lot of overlap, and there has been poorly defined or not defined integration strategies for a lot of this. So now it's time to pay the piper. And I think enterprises are starting to realize both that they need to do this and that not just from a standard IT perspective, but also from an AI perspective, as people are trying to figure out which apps are you going to access going forward, what's going to happen from an agentic perspective, how do you keep yourself from just making calls to 1,000 different apps when you're asking a question.
Well, and I'm going to bring in the next article, and then we can kind of finish talking about it because I think they're very related. The second one, also from CIO Dive, but a study from Synergy Research Group. And interesting looking at the overall spend, and found that cloud spending, or cloud, I guess really the cloud footprint is a better way to think about it. The amount of data center, 44% is now the hyperscalers. And what was interesting is that still means 56% is either on-prem or colo. And to be honest, that actually surprised me that it was still the still majority is non-cloud, but it points to the growing cloud spending, more and more moving to cloud. And to me, what this sort of looks at is I see this sort of synergy. We've talked about the repatriation, and I do think that's a very real thing. We're seeing the repatriation of cloud workloads back to particularly colo facilities. The article also points out we're increasingly running into a shortage in colo capacity because of this. But I think if you put these two stories together, what you are seeing is that there's this rationalization process that is desperately needed to happen as we start looking at our workloads in general and understanding our SaaS footprint, our cloud footprint, our on-prem, all of these different pieces, and start assembling a right-sizing strategy of how you align this to your business objectives and goals. And then the AI piece of this just sort of adds a complicating layer, right, of how you then deal with that. And are you actually bringing this in-house? It did point out that there's been a surge in on-prem, mostly because of AI workloads, but that's probably temporary. And so I find this whole thing quite interesting. And I think the last little piece in this first article you talked about, the Flexera one, it talks about the increasing convergence between FinOps and ITAM. And really it's about FinOps and this overarching view, which we talked about a lot, that the FinOps needs to be this holistic view of all of your spend and all these different pieces as they're all increasingly merging. So I just think it points to just how challenging this is and why you have to stop looking at it in these silos and looking at this holistically.
Yeah, I'm working on my final piece on FinOps right now as I'm finishing up my analyst career. And part of it is talking about how FinOps is not just about the cloud, but also about the data center, also about networking, also about mobility. Really, it is a broad capability. And I think that's a challenge for the FinOps Foundation, who are finding that they have accidentally found this can of worms, this unmanaged IT spend in multiple categories that need to be managed from soup to nuts. They just wanted to manage the cloud space because it was the sexy space and it was growing the fastest, and because developers love new toys. And then now that CIOs are finding that these FinOps organizations are having a lot of success dealing with extremely granular and real-time usage, they are seeing all these other use cases. And I think FinOps Foundation now has to figure out, how much do we want to get into SaaS and networking and software and all this stuff that we thought were kind of settled cost challenges, but actually weren't, now that we can dig into greater detail.
Yeah, and I think it's only going to get more complicated. We talked, I think, a couple of weeks ago about the evolving nature of AI pricing, and that's going to continue to complicate things and going to be yet another. I mean, you think SaaS was tough to predict. AI pricing is going to be even harder. And so you're going to throw that into the mix. I think that, you know, if you are not a CIO and investing in this space of figuring out how to get your head around this, you're going to find yourself really far behind. So, you know, I don't think there are answers in any of this, but I think it's very useful that we're really starting to get some visibility into the true nature of the situation and the challenges that are still facing organizations. Speaking of challenges and the evolution of it, we're going to close on this one. We try to do on something a little bit fun a lot of times, or ridiculous. And this one is really neither, but it's sort of philosophical. Most of us, clearly, and I think if you're listening to this, you came up through the computer science ranks, right? You went to school and got your computer science degree, or at least studied computer science in some form or fashion, and then are in tech. And while I think for a long time, computer science has always been sort of a lagging thing, right? Because what was in use, particularly from like a development perspective, was always ahead. It still is useful, I think, because you had this idea that it was giving you a foundation in these kind of core structured languages, and then you sort of evolved from there. So this article, this is from the New York Times. Basically, the headline is, "How do you teach computer science in the AI era?" And this goes back to some of the conversations we've had over the last several weeks about the rise of vibe coding and this idea that are we even doing coding anymore, right? And some of the talk by different folks that, you know, 80% of entry-level coding is going to be automated now, and yada, yada, yada. And the article points to some of these stats and some of the things that we've talked about over the last few weeks. And basically points to the fact that this is a bit of a conundrum on both sides, because you have the challenge of, does it make sense to teach these languages if there's no entry-level positions? If you are coming out of a computer science degree, how do you get that first job? Right, all these sort of challenges. But it's also one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the article. It talks about how they are only now starting to allow the use of AI. And a lot of students thought, oh, this is great. But then they realized, well, they couldn't figure out if the AI was doing it right because they didn't know the coding to begin with themselves. They still had to learn the coding to be able to use AI to actually do the coding, right? You had to know enough to know if it was right. So to me, it's quite an interesting question. I have one other one that I'm really pondering here, but I'll pause here. I mean, what was your take on this article, and where do you think this is all going?
Yeah, I think we are quickly realizing that the old way of learning a task in college, where we spend several years simply focusing on the technical aspects without any applied use, or is not a practical way to teach something going forward. And I think this is true, honestly, across the board. That simply learning how to code without understanding how code is being created or deployed in the real world is just not going to work. And I think the flip side, as you mentioned, Charlie, is true, that simply because you know how to put in a prompt into ChatGPT and get out some code does not necessarily mean that you know how to code at a level that will be useful in the operational world. But that's something you should start to learn in college at this point. I think it is both necessary to learn a language or two, understand the basics of everything from what is an assembly language, you know, what is machine language, what is an object-oriented programming, you know, what does that look like, what is a database structure, and then being able to use ChatGPT or other LLMs to figure out, okay, I can create the next higher level structure, and then being able to proofread that and understand whether or not this will fit into existing legacy code. That's the real challenge going forward. I think we were already halfway there, because honestly, the past 5 years or so, I feel like anything I really needed to do from a coding perspective, I just went to Stack Overflow or found the library for what I was looking for anyways. How much original code really gets written nowadays? Not that much in the regular world.
I do think, the article I gave right before COVID, when I was doing a lot of keynote speaking, I had a talk that I called The New Human Age, and talked about the fact that what we needed to succeed is you need to have the technical acumen of understanding how systems work, but the real value was having this sort of human layer, and trying to figure out how to apply critical thinking skills of knowing what tool to use, knowing how to play it. And what was interesting is that's sort of what this article is talking about, that they're finally sort of getting there. And I say finally because I think this has always been a gap, or it's been a gap for a long time in the computer science realm, focusing far too much on the mechanics and far too little on the application of how do you actually apply this. So in my, on one level, I'm really excited that this is sort of finally bringing this to real. The philosophical question, though, that's haunting me a bit is this article goes through and tells human stories about people that are now graduating, can't find jobs, and some of the quotes about how there's been this precipitous drop in openings for entry-level positions that are looking for, everyone's looking for now multi-years of experience, et cetera, et cetera. And what strikes me is like, are we not creating a challenge where, okay, so we're turning out these grads and there's no place for them to go, and yet we want people with experience. If we need a pipeline, right? How do we expect that we're going to use AI to close out the beginning, the top of the funnel, and that it doesn't just completely stop everything, right? I mean, it's like, I've heard these people make these, prognostications that, we're going to eliminate all of our entry level stuff. It's called entry level for a reason, right? So what is our strategy? How are we going to solve for this? Because we need a pipeline of talent. And if anything, I would argue our pipeline of talent is all the more important today because the stakes are so high, the pace is so fast. We need good people that know what the heck is going on and know how to do this. So what does that look like? And I find it funny that we're making these big, giant, sweeping statements about we don't need these entry-level positions and these guys are in trouble, but no one's talking about how we actually then bridge that gap.
Yeah, and it's been no secret that the tech job market has always been very dynamic. We're having a lot of layoffs now, but even in the best of times, it has always been a bit of a roller coaster figuring out whether people are hiring or firing, and even sometimes when people are hiring like crazy, like there's no logic to it either. So it's so hard to predict. I think there will need to be a little bit more maturity and perhaps a little bit of a longer commitment if we actually want expert coders or technicians going forward. I know that looking at the law world, there has been a similar problem. My brother's a lawyer, and for a few years now, they've had the problem where nobody wanted to hire a first-year associate, but everybody wanted a third or fourth-year associate. And now tech is in the same. Well,
how did they solve it? What did they do?
Well, it hasn't been solved yet. There's still paucity of third or fourth year associates, and first year associate candidates are increasingly going into tech or into corporate jobs where you don't have the same type of roadmap to become a partner at a law firm, because the partner track is becoming increasingly difficult to manage, and there just isn't enough room for it
so we always want to bring it back to the CIO, and while this is sort of a philosophical macro level conversation, I think as a CIO it is something that's relevant to you because you need to be focused on your talent pipeline. You need to be figuring out how to do that. I think in the short term you probably don't have an immediate problem with all the layoffs. There's definitely going to be some very experienced talent out there that you can get off the streets. But longer term, I do think it's, we started talking a little bit about baseball, right? We love talking about baseball on the show. I think, the dynasties, the teams that win over the long haul are not the teams that can make the big splash and acquire big talent in the long run, right? The long run, it's the teams that build a farm system that
Yep.
know how to mature and develop their talent, and more than anything, mold them into their style of play of how they're going to win. And I think this is true for tech companies, and I think it's true for enterprise IT organizations, is you need to have an ethos. You need to have an idea, a vision of where you're trying to go, and the kind of talent pool you're going to need to get there, and start building that talent pool and maturing it. I don't think you can, and this goes all the way back to the superintelligence question and with Meta. I actually see this acquisition hiring that they're going through at Meta as a bearish signal, because I do not think you can acquire your way into this. I think that you can acquire some talent as a seed, as a kernel, but then you have to build your talent pool around that. And I think that's true in enterprise IT. And I think the stakes are only going to get higher. So
yeah, I feel like companies like Meta and Google, they already have all the talent. Their problem is not that they need more talent. Their problem is cultural, not talent or resource or money based at this point.
Well, I guess we will see how this story unfolds, but definitely it's going to be interesting to watch.
Yeah, and definitely work on your bench strength and your culture and your talent acquisition and your onboarding capabilities, because honestly, it's getting harder for everyone. CIOs that have figured this out are going to have a big advantage going forward, even in the world of AI.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And on that note, thank you so much for joining us for another week of This Week in Enterprise Tech. Please feel free to like, comment, reply, let us know what you thought, what you'd like us to look at next, and we'll be coming back to you with another week of insights next week.